introduce our next speaker, coming from the philosophy department of Stockholm University. Comments will be made by Professor Barry Smith from the Institute of Philosophy from London. So, whenever you want, Jonas.
Thank you.
Do you want me to tell what 40 minutes when you have 5 minutes left? Or?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a talk about indexical reference, and I will start by going very briefly through some preliminary stuff. So in the recent debate on indexicals, most participants take something like Kaplan's general framework for granted. So we have, and I won't go through the details here. I hope most of you are familiar with it, and if you're not, it's not going to be a big problem. I'm going to tell you why this is relevant in just a few seconds. So you have these notions of character, content, which corresponds to levels of meaning. You have the context and the circumstance, which corresponds to two different stages in the semantic evaluation of a sentence. And you have this general picture where you have characters which function as the taker from a context to a content, and contents are functions from circumstances to extensions. So Kaplan was mostly interested in constructing a form of semantics to get certain things right about indexicals, including certain modal intuitions. But when you start to think about how this kind of framework could be applied in a more general way, also to real life utterances, not just to abstract pairs of contexts and sentences, then a certain kind of question arises, and I'll refer to this kind of question as representational questions. And what I will focus on here is a particular representational question. So, in general, the question is how do these different formal elements that we have in the framework relate to what they represent? So we have this, characters and contents and context and circumstances as they occur in the formal theory. They are not really, they aren't the things themselves, of course. They are representations of certain things. So characters represent something like stable, conventional meaning. And what's most pertinent to my present topic is the relation between Kaplanian contexts, which are conceived of which are modeled as the term context for Kaplan is a term for a formal element of the theory. So it's an index with certain features, has certain parameters for certain contextual facts, like who is the speaker, what is the place, time of the utterance, and so on. So then we can ask the question, what features of a real-life situation in which a certain utterance is made determine what context index pertains to this utterance? Okay. So we have this important distinction, which some people have suggested that this distinction between context indices, that is the formal elements of the theory, and real context situations. Some have suggested that this distinction should just be abandoned when we start to focus on this other project of trying to account for real-life utterances, because then we need some other notion of context, which is more sort of less tied to this formal framework. I think we should uphold this distinction and instead focus on the question about the relation between this representation in the Kaplanian framework and what it's supposed to represent. So that's the representational question. What features of the real-life utterance situation determine the context index? Okay, so there are of course many ideas about this. My focus here will be on what I call subjectivism, which in general is the idea that context indices represent subjective mental states of language users. So there are some who think that should rather be objective features of the utterance situation, or something like that. But there are a lot of views out there which gives subjective mental states a crucial role in determining these context indices. And you can choose to focus on either the speaker or the audience side. So one can think that, for instance, the speaker's intentions are what determines the context index, or one might think that it's rather the audience's expectations or beliefs that determines the context index. So there are a lot of possibilities, even if we restrict ourselves to subjectivisms. There are many theories on the table. I think there are some reasons to favor subjectivism over purely objectivist accounts, but I won't go into that here because I don't have time, and also the things I will talk about can be seen as internal to subjectivism, as you'll see in a moment. So I won't go into these reasons here. Also, I have in other places, in another paper, I have proposed what I've called a ecumenical subjectivist view, which takes both of these sort of kinds of theories into account. So I allow both the speaker and the audience side, as it were, to have a role in determining the content, and in a way which differs from other people who had similar ideas, but on my view it's a bit different. But I won't go into this here. Rather, I will just focus on the speaker side. Okay. So these are some things that I will not do. And if you focus on the speaker side, there is this common assumption, both among proponents of subjectivism and critics of it, namely that the relevant mental states on the part of the speaker are to be conceived of as some sort of intentions. So this is an assumption which I will question in what follows. And for that reason, you can see this as being a project which is sort of internal to subjectivism. It can be seen as just, you can see these arguments just as or the considerations I will present will, I hope, convince you that this is not the best form of subjectivism. So in that sense, it's internal to subjectivism. But I will have some things to say that at the end, which has to do with subjectivism in general, and so there is this very common objection as well, which is directed at these intentionalist views, which usually goes under the name of the Humpty Dumpty objection or something like that. It's associated with the Humpty Dumpty theories. The idea is that it seems easy to form an intention to refer in a highly idiosyncratic way, okay, but it seems much harder to succeed in so referring. So we have various versions of this argument has been given by Eros Corazza, Jonathan Gorvet, and also more recently by Jonathan Cohen. So I will focus on Cohen's version because it's concise enough to just be given in a fairly short quote. And I'll have some things to say about this objection, but just to make clear what I'm doing, I'm not going to go in very in much detail as regards this discussion between intentionalists and the critics. I'm going to explain what the objection is, and then I'm going to just indicate some possible responses, and from there I'm going to focus on what I take to be a general insight of these responses, and then I'm going to leave this aside, and then I'm going to tell you about the plan of the rest of the paper. So if you're completely lost now, I promise I'll bring you back soon. So this Humpty Dumpty objection can be put as follows, as Cohen puts it. So the intended context view wrongly predicts that users can change the semantic reference of their indexicals merely by changing their intentions. Now, I can surely form the intention that my utterance of "I'm not here now" be evaluated with respect to a context in which Barack Obama is speaking in Washington, D.C. in the winter of 2006. What could stop me? you'll see in a moment that there are some ideas about how one can stop Cone from doing this. But okay, but by forming that intention does not make it the case that the content so expressed involves Obama, Washington, D.C., or the winter of 2006. So the intended context view results in a Humpty Dumpty picture, according to which change of semantic reference is extremely easy. However, the semantic properties of public expressions, index codes included, do not appear to vary as freely as the speaker's intended context for a string can. So what can an intentionalist say about this? One thing one can say, which is probably perhaps the most obvious and response, is to pay a little more careful attention to what kind of intentions are relevant here for determining reference in general and context indices in particular. And focus on this sort of Gricean idea that referential intentions are communicative intentions. So in order to have a genuine intention here, in order to have an intention which is of the right kind here, you must it must be a kind of communicative intention. So you must not only intend to the context or the content to be a certain you must not only intend to express a certain content or do it with respect to a certain context, you must also intend to communicate this. You must also intend for this intention to be recognized by the audience, or however you choose to specify the content here. That's the general idea. And then you add this general, or just make use of this general constraint on intention forming, to the fact that you cannot form an intention to X if you don't think that it's possible for you to X. So if you don't think, as most reasonable and rational speakers will, reasonable and rational speakers will, in these kind of Humpty Dumpty cases, will not believe that they can succeed in communicating, so they will not succeed in forming this kind of intention. That's one way to go. Another way is to focus on constrain reference more directly. So the idea there would be to say that the index reference is partially constrained by conventional meaning or standing meaning and objective context. So this is an idea that Elliot Michelson has defended recently. And as I said, I won't go into these details about these responses. I'll come back to them at the end. But the point now is that I think both of these responses reveal an important insight, namely that these mental states, whatever they are, I mean, if you're going to be a subjectivist, you shouldn't think of these mental states as just formed in a void. I mean, you should think of them as fitting into some kind of structure. And that is what I will focus on now in what follows. So you have this. I'm going to give you this quote from Cote and Perry. Acts of using language or utterances have a basic structure that is an instance of the general structure of actions. An agent, by moving her body and its parts in various ways, in various circumstances, accomplishes things. So I'll be talking a bit about this structure of utterances and what follows, and that is why I want to lift this insight to salience in the beginning here. So, so this kind of consideration has might be taken to support this intentionalist assumption. This assumption that these mental states should be conceived of as intentions of some form. I think there are two plausible points here that should be acknowledged. One is that, of course, fully understanding an utterance includes ascertaining the intentions behind it. So that's sort of to really understand an utterance in the full sense of understanding. You need to know sort of just like intentions are. This is important in general when it comes to understanding an action. So fully understanding an action requires that you sort of understand the intentions behind it. And same thing goes for utterances. And also, given that utterances are conceived of as actions in this way, we should expect intentions to play a central role in an account of linguistic utterances, just as we expect them to play a central role in a general account of action. Okay. But the question is if these points really support this common intentionalist assumption, and I think that they don't actually. So I think we can concede this point without being forced to accept that these mental states must be conceived of as intentions. So as regards the first point here, fine, yes, we need to understand an utterance. In order to fully understand an utterance, we need to sort of understand the intentions behind it. But that doesn't mean that we need to take intentions to determine context indices, because fully understanding an utterance in the sense which is supposed to be analogous to understanding actions here plausibly goes way beyond just interpreting, giving a semantic interpretation of an utterance. So this needn't, this doesn't force us to take the context indices to be determined by intentions. And also, I agree that a proper account on linguistic utterances ought to assign a central role to intentions. But as I hope you'll see in what follows, intentions can be assigned a central role in the action explanation of an utterance without being assigned the role of determining context indices. So these are two but different roles, and I think they're completely. I think they can be conceived of as being unconnected without giving up. So you can give up this idea that intentions determine context indices without having to give up the idea that intentions play this important role. Okay. And this is the kind of view that I will propose instead is what I will call the Coase view. And the idea is that there is some more another mental state on the part of the speaker which is more basic, and which is a better candidate for the role of determining context indices. And this is what I call the speaker's conception of the situation. And the proposal I will make is that the Coase view is preferable to intentionalism. So now I'm going to give you the plan on the paper. Let's see. So what I want to show is that how these conceptions of situations fit into the structure of utterances, and how intentions retain their central role. And that's where I'll start. And then I'll go through some other points here. Some things that I think are good features of this Coase view. That it fits nicely with this Kaplanian semantic framework, and also how you can see, when you adopt this view, you can see very easily how this form of theory can be invoked in explaining communication. Also, I will raise some problems which are, I think, not very original, but objections to intentionalism that the Coase view can avoid. And at the end, I will say something more general about how the Humpty Dumpty objection can be met. Because, as you saw, these proposals on how these ideas about how to respond to the Humpty Dumpty objections were formulated in terms of intention. So if you abandon that assumption that intentions are that the mental states are intentions, you need to say something slightly different about Humpty Dumpty. Okay, and I'll start with these two. So I'm going to give you a very rough and in many ways inadequate, but for present purposes, I think this is sufficient as a description of the structure of an utterance. So you have an agent which is in a certain situation, and it forms this intention, CI. Let's suppose it's a communicative intention. So it's an intention to communicate a proposition. And then this agent selects an expression in her language, and this selection is based on her judgment that this is a good means to carry out this expression, this intention in this situation. And this leads her to form the subintention SI to utter this expression. Okay? And then she carries out this subintention by means of certain bodily movements. And if all goes well, this communicative intention is carried out by means of the utterance that she makes by executing this subintention. So we can note that in carrying out this communicative intention, the agent relies on two main informational inputs, namely her linguistic knowledge, which I'll abbreviate LK, and also her conception of the situation. So this is how this conception of the situation fits into sort of this very simple structure of the action, namely as an informational input. Her ability to choose the appropriate expression and thus to form the appropriate subintention, SI, depends crucially, but of course not exclusively, but it depends crucially on her linguistic knowledge and her conception of the situation. So the conception of the situation plays a crucial role, but it also allows. I mean, this picture doesn't conflict at all with the idea that the communicative intention here can retain certain key roles, namely initiating the action. Everything starts with this communicative intention. That's what sort of initiates this action, and also it can take it to monitor the action to its completion. So these are two common, I guess, relatively uncontroversial desiderata on a theory of intentions in action theory. And there are other roles for intentions like prompting or terminating practical reasoning, coordinating behavior, etc. And I don't think there's any particular reason why, or obvious reason at least, why these other roles cannot be retained on the Coase view. So that was how conceptions of situation fit into the structure of utterances, and also how these intentions can retain their central role. So now I'm going to say a little bit about how the Coase view fits with the semantic theory, with Kaplanian framework. So I'll turn to the third point on this list. And I'm going to be quite brief here. It's a very simple idea. It's just, so, as Kaplan himself pointed out, it's very natural to take in characters to represent linguistic knowledge. That's the whole point of introducing that notion. It's supposed to represent meaning in the sense of what is known by the competent language user, conventional meaning or stable meaning, or whatever you choose to call it. So my present suggestion is that it's just as natural to take context indices to represent conceptions of situations. And I base that partly on what I said just before, how they fit in. They fit into the structure of this, the structure of the action in a similar way. There are these crucial informational inputs. Okay. And also the semantic content assigned by the utterance by each subject, their own sort of subjective content, their own subjective interpretation, is arguably determined by their own the linguistic knowledge and their own conception of the situation. I mean, if you would ask the subject to state which content she would express, that answer would be determined by these two things. And this is nicely reflected in the Kaplanian theory. So you have the character, which is determined by the linguistic knowledge, which is a function from context indices, which are determined by conceptions of situations, to contents. So you can see how on a subjective level this sort of fits together and explains how this subjective interpretation is achieved. Okay, and relatedly, so how the formal theory, when we understand this, when we answer the representational question this way, we can see that. So, given what I said about this subjective assignment, we can use the formal theory now to model how communicative success is achieved. And so, if you think about communicative success as interpretive convergence. That is the two. So you had two speakers, and one of them utters a sentence, and the other one interprets it, and the speaker has this subjective interpretation of her own utterance, and the audience will have her subjective interpretation of this utterance. And if these two converge, then that will intuitively be a case of communicative success, at least as regards the semantic level. I mean, so this is very sort of straightforward. I think how you can see how this model can contribute to explaining communicative success. Okay, so now I'll turn to these alleged problems for intentionalism. So one is that it's a good thing I don't have the remote control, because then I would be on the other side by now. So people do things with language which doesn't really sort of fit nicely with this neo-Gricean picture. So, for instance, they speak to infants, they speak to pets, and even to dead people. I mean, this isn't even. I mean, these are everyday examples. I mean, I was myself a witness of the first one here. So that's my daughter and my grandmother. So I've seen it myself. It happens. But presumably, these speakers know that such substandard audiences cannot really interpret these words. So they cannot really be we cannot plausibly assign a communicative intention to this, or ascribe a communicative intentions to these people, since they cannot rationally intend to communicate anything with these utterances. So this is at least a prima facie problem for Gricean kind of view. This idea that these intentions are supposed to be communicative intentions. So one thing that one might do here is to retort to some other notion of some other kind of intention. For instance, an expressive intention. But it seems that there can be cases. I mean, I haven't witnessed this myself, but I'm familiar with it from fiction. So consider a person who has been given a drug, a kind of truth serum or something, which just puts her out of control of her speech. So as a result, she comes to express many thoughts that she never intended to express. So this might be during a crime investigation, we might have a reluctant witness, and then we have this fantastic drug that we can just give this to this person, and she'll start to blurt out facts about various scenes that she has been the witness of. But of course, I mean, by hypothesis, the speaker doesn't intend to express anything; it just happens. And sort of this, one might think that this truth serum sort of exploits some more sort of basic cognitive structure within the speaker's mind, because I mean, it might still she still uses language here as if she intended, as in the cases where she intends to express things. It's just that the intention is lacking. So I think this has some. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that these are, I mean, completely knocked down arguments. I mean, there's a lot to be said about these cases, but I think that they at least suggest that whatever it is that determine context indices can remain in the absence of intentions of both of these kinds. So because it seems to me at least that it makes perfect sense in both of these cases. One might say that, well, okay, there's some sense in which these are not genuine utterances. So, I mean, there's something missing here from sort of, they're not paradigmatic cases of speech, perhaps, but still it makes sense to apply semantic theory here, So I think as long as that makes sense, I mean, why shouldn't we let that be a factor when we choose how to construct a theory? I mean, it would be better to have a theory that can cover these cases as well. I think at least we should have a good reason why we shouldn't, and I haven't yet seen such a reason. So the idea is that in the context index here is just that a context index can pertain to an utterance even if there is no intention at all on the part of the speaker of the relevant kind. And if that's right, we need to have something else that plays this role. And I'm assuming that is something which is more cognitively basic. And what is this more basic thing? Well, my suggestion is that it's a conception of a situation. Okay. So before I get back to the Humpty Dumpty objection and conclude, I'm going to say something very brief about what concept of a situation is, because I think this is. I mean, I should have said that this is very much work in progress, or at least it's unfinished. I hope it's also in progress, but it's. There's a lot of work left to do, but I'll just present some of the ideas that I have apropos this notion of a conception of situation. So very simply put, these conceptions of situations are, I think of them as sets of beliefs about the utterance situation, including beliefs about, of course, the physical environment, the other participants of the conversation, the purposes of the situation, and also what facts and objects counts as salient and take center stage, as it were. And also how these features can be manipulated. And the reason for having this last point is that there can be cases where you know that by just making a certain utterance, you can make a certain object salient. So you want the semantic theory to account for that kind of case as well. So I think a crucial notion here is, of course, the notion of salience. So I want to say a little bit about how I think about this notion. So I think of it as a subjective notion. And I think also that there is so there's no such thing as objective salience. This salience to a certain person in a certain situation. One might be able to abstract in some way and have some kind of account of what people tend to attend to under certain conditions, but the way I'm using the notion of salience, it's at a subjective level. Okay. And I think it makes sense to distinguish between different notions of salience. So you have perceptual salience and mental salience, for instance. So I'm going to give you an example here, just to get a sense of what this distinction is. So so one might suppose this is guy A who is completely obsessed with B. He's obsessed with B to the extent that B is always on A's mind. Okay, so and due to this mental salience of B for A is inclined to assign B as the referent for virtually any occurrence of the pronoun he. Okay. Now, but since A is still lucid enough to take take B to be not to be communicatively salient, as it were. I'm sorry, I mixed up the examples. This pertains to the next one. Let's do that first. So you can have communicative, something which is communicatively salient and sorry, I just start over. Sorry, I mixed up the examples. So the perceptual salience and mental salience. So you have two persons. One is looking out the window, looking at something which is out of the other one's sight. So A is looking out the window, B is watching A. B cannot see what A is looking at. Still, B can use an indexical or demonstrative here to refer to what A is looking at by saying something like, stop looking at that and get back to your homework, or something like that. Okay. So here we have something which is perceptually salient to A, but of course it's not perceptually salient to B. It's still sort of communicatively salient, and also mentally salient to B, but not perceptually salient. And then this other case that I'm with the obsession thing. So you have these two speakers. One is A is obsessed with B, and also C knows this. Sorry, that's a more complicated case. Forget about C. Anyway, A knows that of course that B isn't communicatively salient in every context. Okay, he knows about his obsession, so he tries to compensate for this. So he has these two notions of salience, which affects how he interprets utterances. One is this sort of mental salience of B, which sort of forces itself upon him all the time. But he can suppress that and adopt a communicative perspective. I think no, the communicative perspective is the relevant one, and and communicatively B is not salient, and he can sort of see that other things in the environment are salient, or something like that. So as you see, I don't think these distinctions might not be clear cut, and but I just want to sort of give you an idea about this difference, how these different things may affect subjective salience, and that you shouldn't just speak of subjective salience to core. You should speak of you should. I think these are useful distinctions to make, and I think it's also worth noting that it's purpose relative. So this is a point that Delia Graffara has raised in quite a different context in her work on vagueness, but. I think the point is a good one. Depending on what purposes are, what your purposes are, different things can become salient, even if everything else remains the same. So you might conceive of the purpose of a certain conversation as being to communicate, and then you will perhaps regard certain things as salient, and then you might have a quite different purpose. You might not be cooperative. You might be sort of egocentric in some way, and think that no, I don't care about communication here. So I'm going to so you take a different perspective on the situation. You take the purpose of the conversations to be something else, and thereby you sort of make other things salient to you. So how am I doing on time? 7 minutes, okay. I'll probably just go on. Yeah. I think that a speaker can be, according to the way I think of conceptions of situations, a speaker can be very uncooperative. Have a very egocentric perspective. Take things to be salient which are not at all communicatively salient, and still be counted as expressing semantic contents. So this is a difference from this kind of neo-Gricean intentionalist subjectivist views, where you focus on communication. So you take genuine referring to require that you have a communicative intention. So that's not. I reject that idea. I think that you can have very uncooperative, uncommunicative, egocentric speakers, which can still count as expressing semantic contents. And so we should, allow their conceptions of situation to determine context indices as well. That's fine, on my view. Also, a problem with Gricean theories of meaning in general is that they run the risk of requiring quite a lot of psychological sophistication, and perhaps more than is plausible to ascribe to people that we would want to count as being able to express meanings and refer and so on. And the way I think of a conception of a situation is it's much more flexible. It's flexible enough to accommodate a wide range of degrees of psychological sophistication. So even if it can be, I mean, of course, you can have a very complex conception of a situation. That's not required to determine these parameters of the context index. That's you can have a very rudimentary conception of a situation as long as it's sufficient to determine the required reference. That's fine. Okay, so now for the last point here. So as I said, I mean, if you drop the if you follow my suggestion to drop this intentionalist assumption, you cannot use exactly the same strategies as the one I suggested in the beginning. So you cannot say that you cannot appeal to constraints on intention forming, for instance, in the same way as a neo-Gramscian could. But I think you could. There's something very something quite similar that you could do. I mean, so you have conceptions of situations consist of beliefs, and beliefs are normally taken to be constrained in various ways, constrained by sort of the evidence you have and so on. So I think you can have similar constraints on belief forming, which can do the same job. And there's also, I mean, the other strategies is also possible to invoke in some form, but I'll skip that now. But as I perhaps you perhaps was you might have suspected from what I said about egocentric speakers, these kind of constraints wouldn't, on my view, rule out Humpty Dumpty reference, because you can have these very egocentric, uncooperative speakers. They can be egocentric to the extent that you can end up with Humpty Dumpty situations where you have something like the case with Cohen saying, like, wanting to use "I'm not here now" to refer to Obama in the winter of 2006, or something like that. But I think this is the price we'll have to pay for this high degree of flexibility. So I mean, I haven't thought through this in any great detail, but that's at least my hunch that it's not going to be possible to get a view which is as flexible as I want it to be, without also allowing for the possibility of Humpty Dumpty cases. Precisely because it allows for these uncooperative and egocentric speakers to express semantic contents. So, the question here is this too expensive? Is this a price we could possibly be willing to pay? So, and a way to put this question is I mean, is there not a very intuitive sort of mismatch between the speaker's referent and the semantic referent in Humpty Dumpty cases? I think that's okay. I think there might be. Depends on the case and whose intuitions you consult. But I think that's in general a reasonable claim. But I think there's also a way which one might explain away this intuitive mismatch. So you don't have to do it in terms of an actual mismatch between the semantic content and the speaker content. It might just be that the lack of transparency in a Humpty Dumpty case leads you to think that there must be a mismatch here. So since you can't, from the point of view, so you from you sort of see the situation. You have this interpreter, and you see Humpty Dumpty. You see this utterance that you know that this interpreter cannot possibly interpret. The speaker's behavior is, in a sense, completely opaque to the interpreter. He cannot see through the behavior and make sense of the speaker in any plausible way. And I think this one thing that's possibly supports this idea is that if you increase the transparency, if you sort of, for instance, if you know, so take the case with this person who's obsessed with another person. So A is obsessed with B. Suppose C knows this, then she might be able to actually interpret A successfully. And when we know these facts, I think some of the intuition that there is this mismatch is somewhat weakened, at least. And I think the weakening of the intuition looks to be at least somewhat proportional to the degree of transparency. Okay. Then, of course, one might think that so lack of transparency here is something that should be taken to rule out reference. But I've argued against that elsewhere, and the example I have, which is from Citizen Kane. We have this film starts with he on his deathbed he utters this word rosebud, and then no one knows what that refers to, and the whole point of the film is that people are trying to find out what this refers to. So, I mean, and it's completely non-transparent. You don't know enough to no one has a clue what this refers to, and then, of course, you're still inclined, when you've seen the film, you're inclined to say that Rosebud, as he used it in the beginning of the film, referred to this sleigh, which you find out is the reference in the end. So I don't think lack of transparency should be taken to rule out reference. So just to make a little bit clear what my response to the Humpty Dumpty objection is supposed to be. So it is possible on the close view, but this kind of so one thing is this transparency intuition, and then this other thing, whether or not it's as these objectors claim, whether it's easy to, as we saw with these other intentionalist strategies, the other responses to the Humpty Dumpty objection, the point was to show that no, it's not easy to just refer. You cannot just form intentions at will, and it's not easy to just change your intentions and so on. And it's a similar thing here that I like to present, that to have a conception of a situation, I mean, it's constrained in various ways, and it's a Humpty Dumpty conception of a situation will require quite a radical deviation from standard communicative practices. So, and I think that such deviations are difficult to achieve for normal communicative speakers. We're used to communicating, so it takes a certain effort to deviate in this way from our standard communicative practices. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, of course, but it's not easy. Okay, so it's not easy to attain Humpty Dumpty reference. It's not easy to just decide to refer however you want, because you're constrained by various things. And that's it.
So just before I start, I'd like to thank Jonas for his paper. It was a pleasure to read. It's extremely clear, and unlike so much refereeing that we have to do, it was great to read a paper with ambition and a large vision, so thank you for that. Just waiting for the computer to stop showing me the circle of death, which, as you know, if you're a Mac user, is just awful. Okay. Also to thank KEPA, not only for hosting the PLM workshop, but for bringing us to this wonderful corner of the Basque Country, so thank you for that. Right. So here's what I want to, I hope. Circle of death. No, it's okay. Let's come back. So Jonas is going to give us a theory of indexical reference, or a theory of how semantic values for indexical expressions have to be settled. So we know that when we're using or uttering expressions with I, now, here, and so on, that context plays a role for sure in settling these semantic values. But what notion of context is at work, and what does the fixing? So we can go back to this old idea that Kent Bach had, like so many ideas, they all come from Kent Bach. It's like footnotes to Plato, or so he claims. This is filmed. Hi, Kent. So Kent said, well, we've got a weak and a strong notion of context. The weak notion of context is just that we've got the physical or objective features of the act of utterance. We've got the time, we've got the place, we've got the physical environment in which an utterance is produced. But the strong notion of context is that we might appeal to what's in the mind of the speaker, and in particular the speaker's intentions. And that's always seen as a bit of a cheat, because if we're trying to figure out how context plus the linguistic meaning of expressions helps to fix what is said or what's communicated, then just appealing to what the speaker has in mind might just seem too easy. Now, Jonas is attracted to something in the stronger or the mentalist version of appeals to context here. And he talks about his view as one which is supposed to talk about what determines what he calls the context index of an expression, sentence uttered in a context. So the Kaplanian framework, we're appealing to context of use, and that's an index with parameters for agent, addressee, time, perhaps location. So what fixes the parameters or the values of the parameters for the context index? Objective features, the time of the utterance, the place of the utterance, who's actually speaking or uttering, or do we need what Jonas calls a subjectivist account? Now, I guess you're going to continue with this vocabulary, and others in their way will take it up and copy you, but I really don't like this idea of subjectivist here. I don't see why it's subjectivist. I mean, what you're doing is explaining that instead of physical features of the world, there are going to be mental features or speaker-centered properties that are going to be important in doing the explanatory work here. No less objective because they're mental, they're just facts about the speaker's mind. And if they're the ones that do the determining, then they're objective facts about that. That's metaphysically the case, but different from whether or not epistemologically we can have access to those mental states. That's a different issue. And we're not radical Cartesians, so we do get quite a bit of what's going on in other people's minds, as Eros was stressing earlier. So I don't know why we want to call it subjectivist, but it's your vocabulary. You also say that you want semantic theory to explain how speakers and hearers manage to converge in a common interpretation of a given utterance. And I'm a bit puzzled by that. So semantic theory is supposed to do a job in the theory of communication, and I know you and other people from Stockholm have that view, but one might wonder whether what's expressed comes first and a theory of communication comes later. We might actually have to explain what it is that's meant and then give a separate story about what's communicated. And I'm going to suggest later that you elide that distinction and therefore miss something about Grice, which is Grice had two parts to his thinking, a theory of meaning and a theory of communication. They're not the same. And I think the slide between the two lets you say some things rather too quickly against Griceans. I'll come back to that. So maybe instead we want the semantic theory to talk about what people might converge on, what they might actually fix on when they converge, when they communicate, rather than thinking semantic content is, as it were, the result of such convergence of their intentions or other mental states. Okay, but here's what you actually say. You say on a subjectivist approach, the context index or the values of the context index are taken to represent subjective mental states of language users, like speakers' intentions or audiences' expectations. Just take out subjective there. They're just mental states, intentions. Okay. Now, Jonas wants to jettison the intentionalist version of these mental states that we might appeal to and have what settles the indexicals be something else. Now, why does he want to do that? Well, he's going to look at why do we, first of all, appeal to such intentionalist views? Well, that's because we've got answer phone cases, I'm not here now, where It's the intentions to fix the parameters of the context of use, not to the time of the utterance, the physical time of the utterance, or the objective time of the utterance, but to, as it were, relocate it to some future time. But why does that kind of freedom allowed to the speaker by their intentions, why does it cause problems? Well, we saw Jonas telling us because of Humpty Dumpty cases, and we have the Humpty Dumpty case that Jonathan Cohen provides recently. Why can't I intend that my utterance of "I am here now" be evaluated with respect to Barack Obama, Washington, D.C. in winter 2006? Why not? What's to stop me if it's just my intentions that do the selecting of the content index? And Jonas thinks that's a problem, but that his account works better. I won't go through the reasons. We heard some of those earlier. Now, he thinks instead the context index is to be determined not by the speaker's utterance, but by the, intentions, but by the speaker's conception of the situation, presumably the conception of the situation the speaker's talking about. Okay, so it's what I'm thinking of. Now, what is conception of situation? Well, we hear that it's about beliefs about the environment, we hear it's beliefs about the other participants, all sorts of things. But it gets to sound a little bit like, well, whatever I've got in mind. It's that I'm going to have the semantic content determined and the context index determined by whatever I'm thinking of. It might seem as though it's got a certain amount of flexibility and looseness that's just as bad as the intentionalist has when the intentionalist is allowed to intend, a la Cohen's objection, to anything that comes to mind for them. However, we're supposed to get communication working where there's a convergence between the speaker and the hearer's conception of the situation, or presumably overlap will do. Match might be too strong, but overlap would do. So is this an advance? Well, what happens where there is subjective delusion? Well, remember, this is from direct quote from Jonas. The context index pertaining to an utterance relative to a subject represents the conception of the situation of the subject, right? Now, let's consider a delusional subject. Imagine, heaven forfend, that John Perry suddenly became delusional while walking to the shore. More delusional while walking to the shore. Thank you. And so he thinks he's Napoleon, and he also thinks he's in Corsica, and he thinks he's in Corsica in 1815. He's run away from the British after Waterloo, and he thinks to himself, or maybe even says aloud, or to others, I am back here now, and here I shall stay. Very happy. Now we forget the communicative intentions. These can be his expressing his peaceful state of mind. That's why he says something. But the semantic content looks just as remote from what we think of as the situation in the Barack Obama case that Cohen was worried about. Now, it's not an awful lot better than talking about Barack Obama and Washington and 2006. So is it an advance? Well, there's a save by Jonas. He doesn't let that objection settle things. There's a save. He says, look, of course external features of the act of utterance will still have to play a part. They're not going to go away. Okay, hello. So, what are the external features? Well, who's actually speaking, the time, and the place of utterance. No, that would be just surrendering everything to the objectivist. So to try and kind of combine them, he wants to get some of those objective features into the mind of the speaker and into the conception of the situation. So now we have the following. We have, well, however delusional John is, John still thinks of himself in his conception of the situation as the agent of the utterance. But does he have to? Does he even have to think that? There are pathological cases where people suffer from thought insertion and also delusions of control in agency and schizophrenia, where somebody thinks, I didn't do that, I didn't say that, someone is making me say that, someone else is directing me. Now, strictly and literally, they are still the agent of the utterance as an objective fact, but how they're thinking of it, not as the agent. So if we want to get these objective features all psychologically coded up to be inside the conception of the situation that the speaker has, not always going to solve all the cases, okay? And it looks as though if we're constrained here to talk about the present time, the real agent, the location being Corsica and not Donostia, then it looks as though it's actually going to have to be something like the reference rule. So maybe we have a kind of mixed economy here. Maybe we can't have the whole 9 yards for conception of situation, but we have a mixed economy. So roughly, this is the last slide, there are cases and cases. We may actually have to, and we go to the hard cases to test the theory, to push it as far as it can go. So we have to look at these cases. There's another case that he didn't give, which I think is very nice. He's trying to sneak a friend into a gentleman's club in London, I presume, where they abound, in Pall Mall. And friend is female, so she has to dress up as a man. The doorman looks rather suspiciously at this person, and he quickly adds, "It's okay, he's with me." So if we were using just a reference rule, it doesn't fit, it's a he. But here what you're doing is actually pitching, not from your own conception of the situation, but you're pitching, what will the other person's conception of the situation be? Can I influence it? Can I manipulate it? Maybe that goes into conception of situation, so it's big and rich and it's able to do that. But you know, and again, Kent Bach, the origin of all these great insights, said, we don't have to use demonstratives when we're thinking. So if I'm going to talk about this microphone, I don't have to think that microphone because I just see it. But I use that because you have to be directed to it. Okay? So I'm using something like an awareness of where you are, and that does begin to look like something a wee bit more than just my conception of the situation, unless it gets very rich. Okay, so mixed economy maybe, and in short, many attractions of the view, and I was very glad to see it laid out and articulated, but there are some bugs still to fix. Thank you all.
Okay, so that was really great comments because I guess you touch on one of the things I've been struggling a lot with, namely how do I keep myself from just collapsing back into an objectivist view. So as Barry pointed out, I want constraints, but I want them to sort of kick in at maybe I shouldn't say subjectivist, but mental level, yeah. And also, I'm not at all, terminologically, I would be fine with skipping the notion of the term subjective if it's, perhaps it gives wrong kind of connotations. And so the difference, well, so as you said, the thought is that this will be, and this I think also, at least at this stage, is a problem, that the notion of a conceptual situation is going to be quite rich, and I haven't, I'm not even close to giving a precise account of it, and I think that's what we're going to need in the end, of course, to make this useful. It's going to take a lot more to turn this into something which we can actually use to make predictions and account for all of these different cases. But the thought, when it comes to this keeping clear of objectivism, the thought is that you have the same kind of constraints, right? But they kick in at the mental level. So it's not impossible to what in this last case with the gentleman's club. I think the way you described it was sort of how I thought about it. That you can, in this case, what matters isn't the actual sex of the person referred to. It might be a woman, might be a man, might not even be human. It's just, but I can accommodate what I take to be. Sorry, I can conceive of the situation as being one in which this plays the role as the most salient male, something like that. And this is very hand-wavy and very rough, but that's and I thought that was along the lines roughly what you suggested as well. So I have rough ideas about how to deal with that kind of problem, but it's of course not worked out yet. As regards this other Napoleon case, I mean, that was very interesting. I need to think about these other cases. That's very good. I mean, because of course it's. I think my response works okay for the Napoleon case. So the idea is that in that case you have, if you're using I, then you're the referent is going to be, since you go via the character and via that makes it obligatory to the referent has to be the one which is determined by the character and your conception of the situation. So you can't just sneak around that, and the fact that it's you're actually not the person that you think, so you think that you're actually identical to someone that you're not identical to. That delusional belief doesn't really belong to the conception of a situation. So sort of external to the conception of the situation. That's the idea. But then, of course, if you have these other cases where you don't even think of yourself as the agent of the context, or and perhaps there's a better way to specify the character of I, but I suppose that whatever you come up with, it's gonna be possible to come up with at least a possible case where someone is deluded about that description as well. So yeah, I see the problem. I need to think more about those cases. Let's see. Right. No, this general thing that about that the conception of the situation is going to be just whatever I have in mind. In a way, yes, but it's also, I mean, it's not just any belief, it's not just any sort of what I come to think by just sort of wild association. It's supposed to be constrained by sort of how you mean. So I look at a situation, I form a conception of it. It's supposed to be sort of constrained by that process. And one thing one might fall back on here is some form of doxastic involuntarism, involuntarism, that you cannot, that's not up to me. I mean, I'm not in complete control over all these processes that results in my conception of situation. I think that's important. I think that's parallel to this intentionalist response that there are constraints on intention forming, which also have to do with rationality and yeah. Okay, I should. I suppose I've used my 5 minutes still. Okay, thanks.
Oh, I don't remember these on Corsica. Anyway, I want to offer a distinction that I think will be helpful to you. I don't mean it in criticism of what you said. If you consider Kaplan's theory, his formal theory, contexts have two things that we're told about them. The elements of the context are the inputs to character. That is, characters are functions, and the input arguments come from context. And the second is a definition that, the agent of a context has to be at the time, has to be in a location of the context at the time in the world. Those are the only two things we know. Now, when you apply his theory to utterances, you want to do a further thing. You want to take the context to consist of the time of the utterance, the agent to be the speaker of the utterance, the location to be the place of the utterance. I won't worry about worlds. Now that leads to a further constraint that these things about the utterance are the inputs to character. And is that an ironclad, should that be an ironclad requirement? Now, if you think of things like local, words like local, it seems not. If I say Barry will definitely try the local wines, it looks like local is functioning as an indexical. I'm at a certain place. Local means the neighborhood of a place. And I'm saying the content of my remark is that Barry is going to try the local wines relative to Donostia. But if I were to say, wherever he is, Barry tries the local wines, it looks like definitely true, yeah. It looks like the input to the relation that is assigned by meaning to local doesn't come from the context, but from the quantifier. It seems like the most you could say is that the default input to the character is the place of the utterance, but a permissible input to the character is the value of the quantifier, or maybe something from an aphra. I'm sure if, Barry is planning a trip to, I don't know, Corsica to visit John, I'm sure Barry will try the local wines. There we mean local relative to Corsica. Now, this looks like some flexibility that you could use without being totally subjectivist or intentionalist or whatever it is, or objective, whatever you don't want to be. For example, consider the answering machine case. It looks like when I say, I'm not here now on my recording, the way I want it to work is I want the value for now not to be the time of my utterance, but the time of the hearing of my utterance. So it looks like the input to the character rule is not the time of the utterance, but the time of the hearing. And it seems like there is that flexibility. There is a certain degree of intentional give, even with indexicals. On the other hand, temporal indexicals seem more flexible in this way. So if my mother says, never put off till tomorrow what you can do today, she didn't mean to just tell me about the 2 days on which she happened to be speaking. She was quantifying, and she wanted the input of tomorrow and today to be whatever time I was considering lollygagging, right? So my point is that as soon as you apply Kaplan's theory, you have this question, and if you answer the question in the less rigid way, which is motivated by things like local, you get a degree of flexibility that might help you in your project without falling completely into Humpty Dumptyism. That make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so this is very helpful. I mean, it's and also I think local was a very nice example. I haven't really thought about that kind of case, but I have thought a bit about answering machine cases. Of course, they've sort of been the kind of examples that have been driving this recent debate. And I think that when I said at the beginning that people tend to accept Kaplan's general framework, maybe I should have said that they accept it, but most people also reject this restriction to proper context, that is, context which is such that the agent is at the location of the context at the time of the utterance, at the time of the context, precisely because that makes it impossible to give an account of answering machine cases in terms of the semantics, at least. Okay, so Stefano Predelli has a nice paper on this where he sort of goes through different ideas about how to solve these cases and points exactly to this makes exactly this point that you need to drop this. How are you going to do it? Whatever you take to determine context indices, if you take it to be intentions or something more objective or less mental, it's you're going to have to drop the restriction to proper context anyway. So I think that's the kind of if you want to do it in terms of the semantics, because you're never going to get, as long as you have this restriction and also stick to something like the character rules introduced by Kaplan. So you have this then the semantics is inevitably going to give the result that answering machine utterances are false. So I think that's completely right. You need to think about you need to consider dropping that aspect of Kaplan's theory to get these theories right. So I agree. But was that the point you wanted to make, or was it?
I think proper contexts are fine, because that just reflects utterances. Utterances occur at a time, with a speaker, in a place, in a world.
Mm-hmm.
The question is rather, should those features of the utterance, which are clearly what context was intended to model, should those always be the inputs to the character rules?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think your intentions can change the time, place, agent, and world of your utterance. What your intentions can do is whether to go with the default or to go with some alternative source for the input to the character rules, maybe a quantifier or an afro. So I wouldn't put it quite the way you did.
Okay, right. So one might go. So actually, Cohen's suggestion is that you keep this restriction, but you make an exception for answering machine cases, and it's not just an ad hoc exception. He thinks that you should focus on the tokening of the sentence rather than the production of the sentence. So then what he gets in the end is that this it will coincide with Kaplan's view in all cases except the problematic ones, which is a nice result, of course. So that way you can actually, I think you don't even need to go intentionalist to get that kind of result. This is actually possible to do it anyway. So.
So thanks for the paper, most enjoyable. So I have a type of example. I'd like to know how you handle it. It's similar in the same ballpark as the answering machine examples, and it seems, the sort of example seems to support your view because it has the right flexibility and it's a bit like Humpty Dumpty, even though it's attested. On the other hand, there is a problem with the examples for your terms, and maybe John's suggestion might handle them. So the sort of example I have in mind is, so think of a mother who's just fed her baby, and then talking to the baby says something like, I was hungry, and so on and so forth, in motherese, in which clearly the I refers to the baby, so she takes the baby's point of view. So what you say basically is that the contextual indices are not determined or selected by the speaker's intentions, but rather by the speaker's conception of the situation. But the problem here is that clearly the speaker knows, of course, that she's saying whatever she's saying, so she knows that she's the agent of the speech act. She has that conception of the situation, and she may have others. Maybe there is another conception of the situation in which it's actually a situation in which somehow the baby is expressing a certain state of mind through his smile or whatever. And maybe that's that conception that's driving the utterance. But the problem is that if we have a plurality of conceptions of the situation that are present, co-present, then something must select the right conception of the situation, and it seems that the problem arises again. So what would you say about that?
I don't think it's completely implausible to say that her conception of the situation might be such that the baby is the agent. I mean, just as you can read someone else's speech or something like that, you produce the sounds, but you do it sort of on behalf of, but that wasn't really the point. The point was,
no, actually,
that was
okay.
The
point. I think there are several conceptions. There are several conceptions of the situation. If your conception of the situation is really a representation of a context with an agent and so on, then she has the representation of herself saying the thing, being the agent.
All
but
right.
She also has the representation of the baby being responsible somehow for this utterance. So there are several. Something must select the relevant one.
The mother has different conceptions of the situation, which all competes for.
And that's a problem because you presuppose more or less that there is only one.
Right. I guess I do. So that's probably one of the things that would need to will need more work. But one thing that might help is this sort of what you take to be the purpose of the situation. So if the mother is sort of takes the purpose of the situation, conceives of the situation as one in there's a certain pretense going on or something like that, then in virtue of her thinking of the situation in that way, I mean, having that purpose with this utterance might select that kind of conception of situation, even if there's some other conception in the background lurking which could possibly kick in if she had another purpose with this utterance or something like that. So I'm thinking that if this can be, insofar as this kind of problem can be solved, it's going to be solved in something by appeal to purposes of utterances or something like that. So. There's something else, but that's also why this. I mean, so I think this is actually. So Barry said to me before that he wasn't completely convinced, and actually I'm not completely convinced myself. So I think of this more as an interesting idea to pursue. And this is, I mean, actually you put the finger on one of the things that I've had problems with when I thought about this. I mean, how do you single out which conception is the sort of pertinent one, which is the and I think it's a general problem. I think you're not going to be able to solve that unless you have a rather rich notion of conception of situation and allow it to be determined by other things than only. I mean, your beliefs about the situation are of course going to be influenced by things that go beyond those beliefs. So I think it's compatible with the way I think of conceptions of situations, but then of course there's another question whether I can make this precise and in the end to actually develop the notion in a way that solves this kind of problem. So but it's a good question. Thanks.
Okay, this is a question maybe very generally about the things you call subjectivist or intentionalist frameworks. So in the discussion since Kaplan, there's been one strand of this issue about how to individuate context that's springing back and forth between very structured notions of contexts, sort of like lists, and a little bit like how Kaplan was thinking of it, and the very unstructured ones where it was the situation itself, and then trying to get those two things to hook up together. And the intentionalist story is one way to talk about that connection. So I'm worried about something, and I'd like to hear whether you think the conception of situation picture that you have helps at all with this. So in the kinds of cases that I think are interesting and crucial for thinking about, they're very different from all the answering machine type cases. So it's a totally different kind of thing. So I want you to say something about the following kind of stuff. So lots of people think, and I'm one of them, think the following is a very common feature of speech, is that there isn't a fixed context. What we are doing when we speak is fight about what the context should be. And we're negotiating what our meanings should be. And one way to put that is we're trying to create the context as we're speaking. So this is a somewhat familiar phenomenon from presuppositions, for example. So one of the things you do is you utter a sentence, and the uttering of that sentence includes new things in the common ground as a presupposition, but that could be rejected. And very often it is rejected. And some people think this goes on much more generally. So you might think that when someone starts using terms like a friend, or what's relevant, or what's interesting, or what's good, those are all kind of proposals for how to use that term relative to a particular context, and in some sense, a negotiation about what that context we're in should be. Do you get that general picture? So I'm thinking that one of the things we're doing when we speak is fight about contexts, shape the context with the words we have. I don't see that doesn't sit very well with any subjectivist picture that I know about. So maybe this is a general worry about subjectivist pictures, but yours is one of them. So I'd like to hear how is there some room for this kind of, my conception doesn't settle anything. You can just reject it. And then we fight about what context we're in, and part of what we're doing is create the context as we speak.
Right. So I can see how this. There would definitely be a tension, I think, between a subjectivist view, which takes there to be, a unique context pertaining to each utterance, because that's sort of part of what you're rejecting with this picture, I guess. So you're thinking what does different contexts can be in play, as it were, and then we sort of try to, part of communicating is trying to make them converge. Okay, that's actually quite similar to the way I think about this ecumenical view that I mentioned in the beginning. It's the view that you don't select either the speakers or the audience's context as being the sort of semantically relevant one. You take both of them to be semantically relevant, and you had a semantic theory. You apply it to the speaker, to the audience. You will get the theory spit out a content on both sides, and you can see how that content depends on their linguistic knowledge and their conception of a situation. Okay, those might of course diverge, and when they do, they will try, if they're communicative, to try to make them converge. So you will accommodate the other person's. For instance, if you have presuppositions and stuff like that, that sort of reveals that one of the participants conceive of the situation in a way that doesn't fit with your conception of the situation, for instance, that there is this presupposition in play, then you can accommodate, and you can accommodate in various different ways. I don't think we need sort of a single context. Of course, we have an objective situation, of course, that's the physical environment and the things that are out there, so to speak. But then we don't really need to take that to determine sort of a unique context which they are supposed to converge on. I think of it more in terms of sort of this, you're trying to make these two subjective interpretations converge, and of course one crucial aspect of that is to make your conceptions of the situation converge, to accommodate each other and so on. So that seems to me to be kind of similar to of course I use different, I come from a different theoretical perspective here, so it's not exactly the same formulation, but that sounds like sort of the same general idea, that you don't have a fixed context. You have this, which is sort of objective and shared in that sense. You have this different context candidate which competes for being the one that all the participants take to be the one relevant for interpretation.
Maybe I misunderstood. So I thought the speaker's conception was the one that fixed the relevant indices of the context. So I don't think they do.
Right.
Because
So
I don't think the speaker gets to decide. You can fight over them.
That's if you take this kind of speaker side subjectivist view, that's going to be so I was responding as sort of from my own take on this. Of course, if you take this, the kind of view that the considerations the issue I discussed today was supposed to be new. Not really depend on this ecumenical view. So I'm just sort of discussing the speaker side here. Then there's another question whether the speaker side, as it were, sort of determines a unique context or not. Some people think it does, and I don't think it does. So
that's good. Then it sounds like we agree on the other stuff you're saying. Okay, good.
I think we do. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. My question might in some ways be related, but I'm not totally sure. So I think drawing on a distinction that also I don't know if it's original with Kent Buck, but anyway, something he said between the notion of constitutive determination and epistemic determination.
Right.
And I know that in many applications of the Kaplanian framework to kind of utterances, the idea would be that the character together with the context determines reference in the sort of constitutive sense that Buck means. At least that's one view. So one thing I was wondering is that the way you're looking at it? Because I think at some points you said something like the way the speaker would interpret her own utterance as opposed to the way someone else would. And that makes it sound more like epistemic determination. So we're looking at how the speaker would interpret her own utterance versus, in fact, what things she refers to with certain indexical terms. So I guess one question was, sort of what was the status of your view in that sense? And then I think it relates to some of these issues that are being raised about delusional speakers. And I mean, I think you could have cases where it's not even false belief, it's just absence of belief. So talking in your sleep, or saying something without realizing you said it, that sort of thing. Where it's not that you believe you're Napoleon, it's just that you don't believe that you're speaking, so those kinds of things. And all of those strike me as cases where, there's maybe one thing to say about what the reference of your terms is, and you could have a Camplanian account, you could have some other kind of account, and then, maybe your view could come in and say, but this is how the speaker would interpret her utterance. Alternatively, you might have been trying to give that sort of constitutive account, in which case the problems seem more pressing. So just wanted to know how that cashed out.
Right. So I guess this is the same as I probably read Buck's version of this point, but I don't really remember. But I've seen it's in several places, as you said. So it's so you distinguish between the metaphysical process of sort of determining content, right, and the epistemological process of finding out what the content of a certain utterance is. I think that's a very important distinction, and I've been invoking that at other papers to argue against objections to intentionalism as well. So I think that's certainly a distinction that I like to uphold. So with But I always thought of this as being more concerned with not the speaker's own access to her sort of interpretations, but more like the interpreter's, an external interpreter's interpretation of the utterance. So the way I sort of described it, I mean, I know I spoke in terms of the subject interpreting herself. That might be quite misleading, in fact. I mean, it's more like sort of the content that the speaker would assign to her own utterances. That doesn't need to sort of be taken as going through anything like an interpretation procedure, of course, if you think about that as being this process of looking at the available evidence and sort of making an inference to something like that. So I think I'm not sure. So that's how I always thought of that distinction. That it's so I'm not sure that it will apply in the same way when you just consider it from the sort of first person point of view. Am I completely misunderstanding your question, or is?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on whether you think that. So maybe there's a different notion of interpretation that I do to myself, and so then that maybe needs to be spelled out, unless you're just collapsing that notion of interpretation into the metaphysical or constitutive determination of what it is that I refer to, such that, in a sense, I couldn't be wrong in so you said the content I would assign to my utterance, that, if I couldn't be wrong about that, then it seems like a totally different sort of notion. But if it's still something I could be wrong about in the way that other people could, then it's not clear to me that it has such different
I could be wrong about which content I'm actually expressing. I think that's because you might have elements of your conception of the situation, or the way you track different references, which depend on external factors. So I think that's. But I don't think. So I think the sense you couldn't be wrong about what you take to be the content of your interpretation. That's more what I was thinking of. So given given that you have some way of thinking about. This gets sort of complex because you have these cases where you don't really know exactly what the sort of what the proposition is. You have some way of representing the content, but it might not be more than an indexical representation. So then, of course, if you don't have that access to these external features of the world that you're relying on to fix a reference, then you won't have access to that reference, only to the sort of the character level. but I don't see how that answers your question. So I still think I'm sort of I'm missing a point. We could talk
During
afterwards.
lunch?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jonas.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks for all the questions. Really helpful. Thanks.